It was Vale Industries' annual gala, an event where power dressed itself in velvet and gold. Richard Vale stood at the center of the ballroom, 64, silver-haired, charming, his presence commanding yet strangely distant, like a man watching his own life from across the room. Beside him stood Clara, his 28-year-old wife, her emerald gown hugging every graceful movement. To the cameras, they looked perfect, the picture of a man reborn through love. When Richard raised his glass, a hush spread across the room. "To my wife," he said softly, "who reminds me that love doesn't retire. It simply learns new ways to begin." The crowd erupted in applause, laughter, camera flashes, polite envy. The kind of admiration people reserve for fairy tales they secretly doubt. Clara smiled, or seemed to. Her lips curved just right, but her eyes never softened. As the noise died down, she leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. No one heard what she said, but those near enough saw Richard's expression falter. For a fleeting second, the warmth left his face, replaced by something tight, almost frightened. Then, just as quickly, the mask returned, a gracious smile, a nod to the crowd, another sip of champagne. To everyone watching, it was a moment of charm. But to the man holding the glass, it was a reminder. Love, like guilt, can be performed beautifully, if you practice long enough. Their mansion sat on a quiet hill outside the city. Wide windows, marble floors, manicured silence. From a distance, it looked peaceful. But peace and emptiness often share the same stillness. Every morning, Richard woke before dawn. Old habits from decades of early board meetings never left him. He'd brew coffee for two, pour hers into a white porcelain cup, and set it on the table beside his own. Steam would rise for a while before fading, untouched, like the words he wanted to say. Clara's footsteps echoed down the hall, light but deliberate. She always seemed to glide rather than walk, her presence precise, efficient. "You don't need to attend the Foundation's dinner tomorrow," she said once without looking up from her tablet. "They'd rather hear from someone closer to their generation." Richard smiled faintly. "Of course," he replied, as though agreeing was a reflex. The staff moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb the invisible boundary between them. The butler once said he'd never heard laughter there, not even from guests. Every sound was measured, every gesture rehearsed. Sometimes at night, Richard would find Clara in the library, standing before the tall windows that faced the sea. The reflection of the moonlight made her look almost ethereal, a figure caught between warmth and vengeance. She would whisper something into the glass, soft and indecipherable, then turn away when she noticed him. And in those moments, Richard felt like a man living beside a storm he had once caused, now waiting for it to decide whether to pass or destroy him completely. At Vale Industries headquarters, power was spoken softly, in brief nods, in quiet deals sealed with a handshake no one saw. Lately, though, the whispers had changed direction. They no longer circled around Richard Vale, the founder whose name still gleamed on the building's facade. They floated instead toward his young wife, Clara Voss Vale, who now attended meetings uninvited, yet never unwelcome. Her presence carried an authority that no one understood, but everyone obeyed. She spoke with an ease that unsettled the senior partners. Even the board chair once admitted, "She doesn't ask for permission. She moves as if she already owns the room." One afternoon, the elevator doors closed on a brief, chilling exchange. A junior analyst stepped in beside Clara and a board executive. Thinking they were alone, the executive muttered, "He's losing his touch. The old man lets her make every decision now." Clara's reflection met his in the mirrored wall. "He's not losing anything," she said quietly. "He's finally learning the cost of pretending." When the elevator stopped, she stepped out, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume, and silence heavy enough to follow the analyst all week. Minutes later, Richard entered the same elevator. The staff straightened instinctively. His voice was calm, his eyes unreadable. Yet when he pressed the top floor button, he sighed. The kind of sigh that sounds like surrender. Rumors grew in corners, spreading like a polite infection. Was she manipulating him? Was he too blind with love to see it? No one dared ask. But Clara's gaze often lingered on Richard, longer than it should. Not with affection, but with something colder. Something that remembered. It was meant to be another routine investor briefing. Suits, screens, polite applause. Richard Vale stood behind the podium, reading notes from trembling hands. Decades of experience had made him a practiced speaker. Yet that day, his voice wavered. The numbers blurred. The names escaped him. From the front row, Clara watched, her expression unreadable. When his pen fell from his fingers, She rose gracefully, walked onto the stage, and took the microphone with the confidence of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for years. "Allow me to clarify our direction," she said, smiling at the audience. In measured tones, she announced a strategic overhaul, a plan that reversed several of Richard's long-standing policies. Investors nodded approvingly. They saw poise, intelligence, youth. Richard stood beside her, frozen. He could have interrupted, but he didn't. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks and stared at the marble floor, letting her finish what he once controlled. When the applause came, it was hers. In the car afterward, rain streaked the windows, tracing blurred reflections. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. "Someone had to." She replied, "You've done enough pretending." Her words landed without anger, only precision, like a surgeon's final cut. He turned his face toward the window, city lights flickering across his weary features. The faint reflection of her eyes in the glass looked eerily familiar, as if he'd seen them before. In another lifetime, another face, long before she ever said his name. That night, while the city slept, Richard poured himself a drink and stood before the mirror. He straightened his tie, as if preparing to meet the man he used to be. But the eyes staring back didn't belong to the legend people admired. They belonged to a man who finally understood he was living in someone else's reckoning. The morning it arrived, the sky over the city was colorless, one of those pale, indecisive dawns that seemed to hold their breath. Nathan Cross, an investigative journalist with more regrets than awards, found a plain envelope sitting at his office door. No return address, no markings, just his name written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a small flash drive, cold and unassuming. He hesitated, then pushed it into his laptop. The video began instantly, no titles, no introduction. Richard Vale sat at a desk in his study, shoulders hunched. A pen trembled in his hand. Across from him stood Clara, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut air. "You'll sign it tonight?" she said. "Clara, this isn't about money," he murmured. "No," she replied, "it's about memory, and you owe me that much." He looked up, face drawn with exhaustion. "You don't understand?" "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said. "You'll transfer everything to the trust by morning, or I'll show them what you did to her." The clip ended there. Nathan sat in silence, listening to the faint hum of his computer. He replayed it, searching for context, for a clue to who her was. The timestamp on the video was recent, only 3 days old. Whoever sent it wanted the world to see what lay beneath the Vale marriage. But there was something about Clara's tone, not hatred, not greed. It was the voice of someone who had waited a lifetime to be heard. Nathan leaned back in his chair. He had chased scandals before, but this one felt different. This wasn't just power and betrayal. This was history resurfacing, like a wound reopening through silk. Nathan began digging that same night. He followed threads through old corporate records, conference photos, donation logs, anything with the Vale name. Most doors led nowhere. But one small, half-forgotten name kept surfacing in the company's oldest medical division reports. Dr. Elena Voss, a researcher, dismissed 25 years ago. Official cause, procedural misconduct. Unofficial whispers, she tried to expose something. Nathan found an archived article, yellowed, brittle. It mentioned a failed clinical trial, accusations of falsified data, a whistleblower discredited after an internal investigation led by none other than Richard Vale himself. The article stopped there. No follow-up, no obituary, just silence. Curiosity turned to obsession. Nathan pulled Clara's birth records, her foundation filings, old interviews. Clara Voss. Same last name, same hometown, same birth month as Elena's daughter. He stared at the screen until his reflection blurred with the text. It was impossible, and yet it explained everything. The way she spoke to Richard, the quiet control, the humiliation she delivered not out of cruelty but purpose. Nathan rubbed his temples. He was staring at a decades-old story that had disguised itself as a marriage. He closed the laptop, heart uneasy. If Clara truly was Elena Voss's daughter, then her marriage to Richard Vale wasn't love. It was legacy, written in the language of revenge. But what he didn't know yet was that revenge, once fed long enough, starts to look a lot like grief. The storm that night came without thunder, just wind, restless and cold, as if the air itself remembered something. Richard Vale sat alone in his study, the firelight soft against the polished walls. Before him lay an unlocked drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants of a life he'd carefully buried. Letters, newspaper clippings, a child's drawing folded at the edges. He lifted an old photograph, its colors fading to sepia. A woman in a white lab coat smiled faintly at the camera, her hand resting on the shoulder of a little girl holding a stuffed rabbit. Dr. Elena Voss. He traced her face with his thumb, the way one might touch a scar they no longer hide. "I'm sorry, Elena," he whispered. "I never meant for it to go that far." Behind him, the door creaked. Clara stood silent in the doorway, her reflection framed by the firelight. For a long moment she watched him, her expression unreadable. He didn't turn. Perhaps he already knew she was there. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost tender. "It's strange how the past never asks for permission to return." Richard's hand froze over the photograph. He looked up, slowly, but by the time he did, she was gone. Later that night, Clara found herself in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed with the same photograph in her mind. The girl in it was her, before life became an equation of loss and vengeance. For years she had believed punishment was the only form of justice. But watching Richard that evening, frail and haunted, something inside her shifted. Revenge had aged differently than she expected. It no longer burned. It ached. The next week brought the company's grand anniversary celebration, a televised event meant to honor Vale Industries' legacy. Reporters filled the hall, lights glared, and music played the same melody that had opened 100 of Richard's speeches. He stood before the audience, steadying himself on the podium. His voice was firm but weary. "Tonight we celebrate 60 years of work, progress, and purpose." Halfway through, Clara stepped forward. It seemed spontaneous, but the confidence in her stride said otherwise. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her smile flawless for the cameras. "If I may," she said, taking the microphone. "Tonight, we also honor the lives that built this company, some remembered, some conveniently forgotten." A ripple moved through the audience, she continued, each word sharpened by quiet truth. "Progress should never come at the cost of silence. Every name deserves to be spoken again." The applause came slow, uncertain. They thought it was metaphor. But Richard knew. He felt the weight behind her phrasing, every syllable a gravestone polished in public view. He stood beside her, face calm, hands steady. And when the cameras turned toward him, he smiled and kissed her hand. The audience saw devotion. Clara saw surrender. And Richard, for the first time in decades, felt something like peace. Not because he was forgiven, but because the truth had finally entered the room disguised as love. That night, as they returned home, he thanked her softly. She said nothing, but in her silence, he heard everything. The days after the gala passed in a strange quiet. The headlines praised the couple. Vale's vision continues, love and leadership in harmony. But inside the mansion, the air felt heavier, as if every congratulation carried the echo of guilt. Richard Vale's health had been fading for months, though he tried to hide it behind crisp suits and steady smiles. The morning it happened, he was in a board meeting, mid-sentence, when his words slurred and his hand gripped the edge of the table. His coffee spilled, papers scattered, and then his body went still. Paramedics rushed him to St. Augustine Medical, where machines hummed a mechanical lullaby. Clara sat by his bed, motionless, her phone silent beside her. For years, she had rehearsed the moment she'd see him powerless. But now that it had come, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing in the ruins of something she once needed to burn. When Nathan Cross, the journalist, visited the hospital that evening, he found her alone in the chapel, head bowed, eyes red. "You wanted revenge," he said quietly. "Do you still want it?" She looked up, startled, then exhaled slowly. "I wanted justice for my mother. I thought breaking him would make me free. But I didn't realize." Her voice cracked. "When you destroy someone who already regrets, the pieces stay with you." Nathan said nothing. Some truths didn't need commentary. Outside, the rain fell softly against the chapel windows, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold, like memories refusing to stay clear. That night, Clara didn't return to the mansion. She stayed beside Richard's bed, holding a hand that once built an empire and now could barely hold on to life. When Richard Vale opened his eyes again, the world was pale and slow, like waking into fog. Machines clicked beside him, the steady rhythm of borrowed time. Clara sat at his side, her posture perfect, her face unreadable. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, he smiled faintly. "You've been here," he whispered. "Someone had to make sure you kept breathing," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out like a sigh. "Clara," he said, eyes searching hers, "I know who you are." She froze. "Your mother was brave," he continued. "She warned me about the trial. She was right, but I let the company silence her. I thought I was protecting everything I built. Instead, I buried the only person who still believed in truth. Tears welled in his eyes, his hand trembling as it reached for hers. When you came into my life, I thought God was mocking me. But you were giving me a chance to atone. Clara pulled her hand back, breathing unevenly. You think forgiveness is that easy? No, he whispered. But I think you wanted to understand whether a man like me could ever feel pain the way your mother did. Now you know. She turned away, biting back tears. He watched her go, his voice barely audible as she reached the door. You were never my punishment, Clara. You were my reminder. She paused there, one hand on the frame, and for a moment her eyes softened. Not with love, but with something closer to release. Behind her, the machines kept their rhythm. Slow, measured, running out of time. 2 weeks later, the house was quieter than ever. The kind of quiet that doesn't rest, it lingers. Richard Vale passed away in his sleep sometime before dawn. The nurses said he looked peaceful, but Clara couldn't bring herself to agree. Peace, she thought, belonged to those who forget. And Richard Vale remembered everything until his final breath. The funeral was private. Just a few old colleagues, his estranged daughter Sophie and Clara, who stood at the back of the chapel beneath the stained glass window. She wore black, not out of mourning, but restraint. After the service, the lawyer called her into the study. On the desk lay a sealed envelope with her name written in Richard's careful hand. To Clara Voss Vale. She opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten letter, uneven, fragile lines that seemed to tremble even on paper. To the one who came into my life disguised as punishment, thank you for teaching me what guilt could not. For the sins that money once buried, I leave you everything I once stole. The company, the estate, and my last remaining truth. Use them to make something better than I did. At the bottom, in faint ink, another line. Tell Alina that I finally stopped pretending. Her fingers trembled as she folded the letter back into its envelope. It felt heavier than any fortune. Outside, Sophie waited by the doorway. Their eyes met for the first time. Two strangers bound by a man who had loved both of them in different ways and failed them just the same. Neither spoke. Some legacies were too complicated for words. That night, Clara placed the letter inside a box beside her mother's photograph and whispered, "It's over." But even she wasn't sure if she meant it. The memorial 2 weeks later drew cameras, headlines, and speculation. Everyone wanted to see the young widow of the legendary CEO. But Clara didn't stand in the front row or sit beside the executives. She lingered at the back, a quiet shadow among hundreds of mourners who didn't know what kind of story they were really part of. When her turn came to approach the portrait, she carried a single white rose, no speech, no note, just the flower. The image before her showed Richard smiling, eyes alive, untouched by regret. The world still saw him as a symbol of success. She saw him as the man who finally learned humility too late. She leaned close and whispered, almost inaudibly, "I came to destroy you, and you taught me how destruction feels." A soft wind moved through the hall as she placed the rose at the base of the frame. Reporters waited for tears, for a dramatic gesture, but she gave them none. She simply turned, walked toward the exit, and disappeared into the sunlight outside. That evening, Nathan Cross published his final article. Not the exposé he once planned, but an obituary titled, "A Man Who Finally Learned to Listen." He ended it with a single line that lingered with readers long after. In the end, love and guilt spoke the same language, and both demanded silence. Clara read it from her car, parked at the edge of the sea. The wind lifted her hair as the waves rolled against the rocks below. She closed her eyes, exhaled, and whispered her mother's name one last time. The tide moved in and out, steady and unbothered, as if carrying both their stories out to where even memory cannot follow. Sometimes love isn't about what's returned. It's about what remains when everything else is gone. Richard Vale built towers from guilt and silence, but in the end, it was a quiet act of honesty that made him human again. And Clara, she learned that vengeance can't fill the spaces where love once tried to grow. In a world where power speaks the loudest, maybe their story reminds us that truth has its own voice. Soft, patient, and often waiting for us in the moments we least expect. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments. What moment in Clara's journey moved you the most? And if you were listening closely, you might notice how often Clara's name came up. Drop your answer in the comments. We may feature your name in a shout-out as a thank you for being part of our Fiction Echoes family. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this one, the next chapter is already waiting. Just click the video that's about to appear, and we'll see you there. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a moment of what happens next.